Okay, so welcome everybody to, I think, might now be our 72nd Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. We are very pleased to have Francesco Principe of the University of Padua presenting racial bias in newspaper ratings of professional football players. Francesco has about an hour in which to talk, and there's time for Q&A. While he talks, please do keep your microphones muted. If you do want to ask questions for clarification while Francesco is talking, please do raise your hand, and then I will interrupt Francesco. But there's plenty of time for Q&A discussion at the end. We've got about 30 minutes there if we need it. So without any further delay, Francesco, please do take away your talk.
All right, so we start sharing my screen now. If I can find the right window, it should be this one. Yeah. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you, James, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for attending this talk. So today I will present a joint paper with Jan van Oers, who is also attending the seminar. So as James was suggesting, I can leave all the tough questions to him. So this paper is about the racial bias in newspaper ratings of professional football players. So let's start from the motivation for this paper. So in the recent years, we have seen that there have been like a lot of episodes of racism in the football stadiums. This happened like more or less in all the countries, and in particular like in England and Italy, but also there were some cases in the Champions League and also involving sometimes some of the referees. On the other side, like the international and national federations are taking some serious actions against those who are responsible of these racist acts, such as like banning them from the stadiums, and also like involving like the clubs in the sanctions and in the controls of the fans. However, like this kind of issue is still unsolved. On the top of that, some recent cases also involved the mass media. For example, this is like the front page of Corriere dello Sport, which is one of the, I would say, is the second most sold Italian newspaper concerning sports. The newspaper, meant to introduce the match between Inter and Rome, like a big match of the Friday, but they had this kind of very controversial title because they wanted to refer to this big challenge between like the striker of Inter Lukaku and the defender of AS Roma Smalling, but of course they had like a very bad wording in their title, and there was like a lot of the public opinion was very disappointed by this. Some clubs decided to not allow their players to release interviews to the newspapers anymore, and so on. So like racial bias seems to be a problem not only like for the fans but also for the mass media. So what do we do in this paper? We use data from the Italian Serie A to investigate two main questions. The first one is whether there is a racial bias in the newspaper ratings of professional football players, and the second one is whether this racial bias is also in the wages of the football players. So just to give you like an overview of the results in a nutshell, we basically find that there is such a bias in the newspaper ratings of professional football players. However, like the bias is not present like along the entire distribution, but it's particularly like present at the lower end of the rating distributions, which means that like let's say for the lower ranked players, race seems to be an issue. On the other side, we find no evidence of racial bias in the wages of professional football players. So it seems that clubs simply want like let's say reward the players for their skills, for their on-field performance, and indeed we find of course like a strong correlation between the performance indicators and the wages of the players, while being a black player or a white player does not really have an impact on the wage. So with this paper, basically like we contribute to two main strands of literature. The first one is the literature on the bias in subjective evaluations. So for example, like there is this paper from Jan and his co-author Ginsburg from 2003, and they show basically that in this kind of piano competition, that also like the experts of the jury can make some kind of biased decision, and in particular this was depending on the order of appearance of the piano players on the stage. Some other papers regarding football also show that there is some bias in the voting behavior of the jury for the FIFA Ballon d'Or. In particular, there is some kind of similarity bias, which means that the jury members tend to give like, higher score for candidates from their own countries, national team, or even same continent. Other papers also find like similar bias in the Olympic winter sports, in which basically like the judges give higher score to athletes from their own country. There is also this recent paper published by Alex Krumer and co-authors, who finds that in scan jumping competitions, the judges basically give like higher scores to jumpers from the same country. And interesting, this magnitude is even like the magnitude of this bias is larger for judges who come from more corrupted countries. So it seems that the judges also reflect in their behavior, let's say, the corruption of their own countries. On the other side, like our second and probably main contribution is to the literature on racial discrimination. So from the literature, we know basically that there are two types of racial discrimination, or discrimination in general. The first type of discrimination is the so-called taste-based discrimination, which is like the one depending, let's say, on animus. Some workers simply do not want to work with the workers from other ethnicity, or the same kind of preferences also apply to the employers and so on. So I can, like the employer, or like the owner of the club, for example, can decide like to give like lower wages to some minorities simply because they have like an adverse preference towards them. On the other side, there is like another kind of discrimination, which is labeled by the literature as statistical discrimination. This happens when basically like the individual who is taking decision do not observe, let's say, full set of information, and so it might bias his decision towards a group due to stereotyping. This is the classic case of the employer who cannot really observe the productivity of the worker that he wants to hire, and so he decides like to discriminate workers according to the stereotype of their group or their ethnicity. I will just list here some. Of course, there is like a huge literature on racial discrimination in the job market. I will just list here some papers that regards football. So there is like this seminal paper from Stefan Simaski from 2000. Basically, like he finds that conditional of their wage bills, English clubs with an higher share of black players perform better, which basically means that they are like underpaying the black players in the Premier League. Another paper by Gallo et al., I think also James is one of the co-authors in this paper, investigates like with the English Premier League data, which is like the referee behaviors in terms of like showing cards to players, and basically they find that they give more yellow cards to non-white players, and in particular these players come from, let's say, lower income countries. Another recent contribution comes from Deschamps and De Souza. This paper has been published basically a couple of months ago, and basically they still find that basically like the wage discrimination in the English Premier League disappeared after the Bosman ruling, which means that basically like when players see their like mobility constraints reduced, this may disappear the discrimination in the wages. So to analyze like the issue of racial discrimination in the newspaper, we exploit some kind of characteristic, a very unique characteristic of the Italian media market, sports media market, which is this le pagelle. So basically, like these newspaper ratings are really a thing in Italy. They were introduced like in the late 50s by the editorial staff of the newspaper Il Giorno, and so basically like, this kind of pagelle are done in the same spirit of the school report cards, which means that after the match, generally like on Monday, so after every match, the newspaper published like a kind of report on the performance of the single player. And so basically they rate the performance in a scale which goes from 0 to 10, of course, where 0 is a very poor performance and 10 is an excellent performance, which is like the same thing that happened at school in Italy. So they really use like the same scale of the school. This kind of pagelle, they were introduced in the late 50s, but then during the 70s they really reached like the wider audience, when also like the most important sports newspaper in Italy, La Gazzetta dello Sport, start to publish them, and now nowadays they are published by all the sports newspaper, generally like the day after every Serie A fixture, which is generally on Monday. So just to give you like an idea, le pagelle are made in this form, in this shape. So basically like you have like the picture of the player, you have like the rating, the grade, which is assigned to the single player, and then there is like a short text in which basically like this grade is explained. So in which like the journalists explain which are the reasons for this grade and what is like the performance of the player, what he has done good, what he has done bad, and why like he gets a 6 rather than another grade. The important thing about this pagelle is that they inform like the readership of the newspaper around the performance of the players, and also they are kind of unique in a sense because like compared to the other sport newspaper, they really like rate the individual performance. So they're really meant to rate the individual performance, and then they are used like for several let's say for several goals by sports fan. For example, they are at the base of one of the most popular, let's say, game in Italy, which is this kind of fantasy football league in which you have to create like your own team, and then you compete with your friends or within a league. And then there are also like a monetary prize. So there is also like an incentive for the readership to get to know about this grade, because basically like the points you receive in these kind of games are based on the rating which is given by the newspaper. Also, like just to give you a better overview of the Italian market, of the Italian media market for sports newspapers. So basically, there are like 3 main newspapers, which are like Gazzetta dello Sport, Corriere dello Sport, and Tutto Sport. All of them are kind of super popular across the country, even though we found there are like some let's say differences across the different like socioeconomic characteristics of the readership. For example, like it seems that the readership of La Gazzetta seems to be a bit more educated than the readership of the other 2 newspapers. On the other side, there is also some kind of difference in the age bands of the readership. It seems that indeed like Tutto Sport has like younger readership, and kind of similar patterns also apply for the social class. So it seems that like Gazzetta always attract like, let's say, people with readership with higher income and higher education, while the other 2 seems to attract like people with a lower level of education. So to investigate this issue, we collected some data from Italian Serie A, and then we assembled like a unique data set which records information about the football player in Italian Serie A. We cover 9 seasons from 2009 to 2018. So basically, like, we can distinguish our data in let's say 3 main groups. So we get information about the individual players' characteristics, which are like the age of the player, the position on the pitch, how many caps he had for the national teams, and so on. And of course, we also get information, like a very detailed information about performance from the website who scored. Then we collect information about the ratings, which are given by these 3 newspapers, so like Gazzetta, Il Corriere dello Sport. And then we collect data on the wage of the players. Generally, these data are pretty known to the sports economists, as they are already available in Italy, and they are recorded like a net of taxes, and they exclude any kind of performance-related bonus. So we can say that it's just basic earnings of the player. Then, of course, like, to investigate the issue, we are interested to know which is the effect of the color of the skin on this kind of ratings from sports newspaper on the wage. So we need to construct our variable of interest, which refers to the race of the player. Of course, like, this is kind of the tricky part of the paper. Of course, like previously, Reade would generally like just proceed by coding like the skin tone of the player through a visual inspection of some player photography, and we kind of do the same, or we just try to build a bit more complex measure by following some literature. For example, like there is this paper by Groger, 2011, who studies the contribution of language difference to racial wage differences in the US. So basically, like, we try to replicate this experiment for what concern like the skin tone of the players. So basically, like, we recruited like 4 students and asked them to look at the pictures of the players, all from the same website, which is transfermarket.com. And then, like, they were separated, like, they didn't know they were part of this kind of small experiment. They just were writing their own thesis about sports economics. And then they had to label like every picture and distinguish between black and non-black. And then we aggregated all the score at the player level in order to be like a unique numerical variable, which then ranges from 0 to 4, which is 0 if no one labeled the player as black, to 4 if like all the 4 students labeled the player as black. And then in the regression analysis and in the decomposition that we are going to perform, we of course like just dichotomize these variables, and we give a value 1 if at least one of the viewers labeled the player as black. And then we do some, of course, some robustness check to understand a bit better whether this is like a good way to distinguish. So in this slide, I will give you like just an overview of all the variables that we include in our dataset. So of course, like here, like for us, one of the most important thing is to distinguish like the contribution of let's say the on-field performance and the indicators for being black. So we try to collect like a pretty complete set of variables regarding like the performance of the players. So apart from the usual indicators such as goals, assists, and so on, we also have like some indicators of let's say disciplinary behaviors, but also we have like a bit more detailed information. For example, like number of headers won, tackles, interception, faults, but also like number of dribbling, key passes, shot on targets, on the post, and so on. So we just try to be as more accurate as possible in terms of measuring the performance. So let me give you like some data visualization of these. So in these 4 figures, these 4 graphs, we just show some frequency distribution, current distribution, and so we can already see that there is something like going on here. So for example, if you take a look at the panel A, basically where we distinguish like the rating of black players and non-black players, it seems that there is already like a descriptive difference here, meaning that black players tend to receive like a lower grade from the newspaper. Of course, this is kind of like not conditioning on any kind of other performance-related variable. And kind of similar pattern, we observe a similar pattern for all the newspapers, because as you can see here in the figure C, still like, it seems that there is like a difference. So black players tend to have like a lower rating, and it seems that this kind of thing is like more prominent for Corriere and Tuttosport. On the other side, it seems that there is not a big difference for what concerns like the distribution of the wages. Similar figures appear if we go to like to plot like a cumulative distribution of the ratings. As you can see, like in all the graphs, like even considering like all the newspapers together, but also if we consider them separately, like the red line with concern black players is always like on the left of the blue one, meaning that black players tend to receive like a lower rating. So now let's try to put this like in a regression form. So we start from an assumption. Our main assumption is that if media are unbiased, of course the evaluation of a player's performance should only reflect his own field skills, so only what happens on the pitch, regardless of the color of his skin. And to test this hypothesis, we estimate the following equation. So on the left-hand side, we have the ratings of the player, which is received by any newspaper for the player I in season T. And then on the right-hand side, we have like our main dummy of interest, which is the variable indicating that whether or not like the player received at least one let's say one score as black from the students which were part of the experiment. Then we have a set of performance-related variables, which are all those variables that are, which I showed you like in the table before. Important, these are like, T-1, which means that of course they are predetermined with respect to the rating. So the idea is that rating at time T depends on what you have done in the previous period. Same for the set of player characteristics, which I was telling you before, and then we have like season fixed effect and team fixed effect to account for differences like between season and between teams. Of course, like our main parameter of interest is beta, which measures the effect of being black as compared to being non-black. And then we estimate like this equation with the classical LS and with the unconditional quantitative regression to go a bit, let's say, beyond the mean. So to understand whether or not the effect we find is only like an average effect or there is some heterogeneity across the distribution. Then after like doing like this regression analysis, we implement like decomposition, which is based on the classic Oxaga blunder decomposition, because of course we want to decompose the gap in newspaper ratings between black and non-black into two parts. Let's say there is an endowment effect, which is explained by the difference in productivity, so by the difference in the observable characteristics related to performance. And then there is an unexplained effect, which is due to different returns to covariate, which is the one which is typically like attributed to discrimination by the literature. And we do this both for the OLS, and then we implement the same kind of decomposition following the recent contribution by Firpo et al. With the recent influence function, which is at the base along the unconditional quantile regression. So for every quantile, we can distinguish between these endowment effect and unexplained effects. So let me move to the results. So I will start like showing you the results of the OLS and the relative like Oxaga blunder decomposition. So interestingly, we find that controlling for all the possible performance characteristics, performance indicators, we find that like black players tend to receive like lower ratings for all the newspapers. So on average, they receive like 0.08 points less, and this kind of effect is present for all the newspaper, being like let's say a bit higher in magnitude for Tuttosport and Corriere dello Sport. And then when we go to decompose this effect, as I was telling you in the explained and unexplained component, we see that like it mainly depends on the unexplained part of the gap, which basically the one we attribute to discrimination. Then we proceed like our analysis, also analyzing the wage. This is kind of interesting, and because like, you know, while we find that there is some difference between black and non-black players in the newspaper rating, we find no significant difference for what concerns the wages. So it seems that like football clubs do not really discriminate when they assign like when they offer like a wage to a player. They simply want value for money, so they simply tend to play the player according to the performance, according to the productivity. And of course, like this is kind of the same like in terms of decomposition. Then we move like a bit beyond the mean, because of course, like what we found, let's say in the previous table, what we found with the OLS is only an average effect. So we can only tell that on average, black players tend to receive like a lower grade compared to non-black players. But of course, like, you know, the distribution of the players is very, you know, heterogeneous in terms of time. So we want to understand a bit more what happens in different sections, in different parts of the distribution, and then we perform this unconditional quantile regression in order to understand a bit more like which is the effect in different quantiles of the distribution. And here we see like another interesting feature, which is that basically like, you know, the effect is only present at the lower end of the distribution, meaning that like for lower ranked players, being black represent like let's say major determinant for the ratings they receive. So let's say in the 10 percentile and the 30 percentile, the effect is like strongly significant for the newspaper. Black players still receive like a lower grade. On the other side, like for what concerns wages, we still find no significant effect of skin color on the wage, on the logo of the wage, meaning that like again, like football clubs seem to not discriminate across the board of the players. We go again to decompose this effect, because like one nice feature of this decomposition proposed by Firpo is that, you know, we can distinguish again between explained and unexplained components, also in different quantiles of the distribution. And again, we find that like the unexplained part is strongly significant, meaning that discrimination is happening here again, and this is like present for all the newspaper. Also here we can see like that, you know, the extent of this kind of discrimination is kind of heterogeneous across newspapers. La Gazzetta, like even though La Gazzetta is showing like a negative significant effect of being black on their ratings, the effect is like much smaller when compared to the one of Corriere dello Sport and Tuttosport, and the effect again is like very, very strong, let's say in the lower end of the distribution. Then we proceed like with some sensitivity analysis and some additional analysis as well. So in this table, I show you like some subsamples. So basically, like we split our samples according to the nationality of the players. So first, like what we do, like is like to reduce the sample to only non-black players and to understand whether also there is some favoritism here. And indeed, we find some evidence of favoritism. So when we remove, like let's say, the black players from the sample, we only analyze like non-black players. We still find that Italian players tend to receive a higher grade for the newspaper. So it seems that the newspapers tend to favor Italian players when they give the ratings, when they compile the pagelle. Then we go to analyze like the non-Italian sample. So we exclude all the Italian players from the sample, and we see again that like black players receive like a lower grade compared to non-black players, even though they are non-Italian. Then we perform like a second sensitivity analysis, which is based like in the form of a kind of classification test. So basically, like we get this rating, which is compiled by an algorithm, and which is published on Uscord. So the idea is that we want to run, let's say, our regression against like a rating which is compiled by an algorithm, so not by a human. So to see whether like this kind of bias is present in the algorithm as well, or it only depends on the fact that the experts that we are analyzing here are human beings, so they can make a mistake when they assess the performance. And indeed, like we find no evidence of such an effect on the Uscord algorithm. So it seems that really like what we found is due to the misperception of the journalists rather than something else. Of course, here, like I mean, we are very careful in because of course we are with our data we cannot really distinguish the mechanism at work. But of course, like when we control for such a rich set of performance, it's hard to say that here there is some kind of statistical discrimination, but it might just be some kind of, let's say, journalist-based discrimination due to stereotyping. And then, like with our third sensitivity analysis, as I was telling you, we performed this experiment to assess like the color scheme of the player, in which we recruit for students. So here we do like a sensitivity analysis by distinguish like the score that every player received from the student. As we can see, like, you know, the effect is significant when at least like 3 students label the player as black. But if we see like all the coefficients, like they all go in the same direction, so they're all negative. So it seems that indeed, like, you know, our results do not really depend on the different, let's say, labeling that we assign to the player, but is rather than being black or not. So let me move to the conclusion. So in this paper, we used data from the Italian Serie A to study the determinants of newspaper ratings, in particular focusing on racial bias. We find that there is like such a racial bias in the newspaper ratings of professional football players. However, we find no evidence of race discrimination from the clubs. While this effect is significant for all the 3 newspapers, our results also suggest that there is like a degree of heterogeneity in the presence of such a bias. And in particular, like Tuttosport and Corriere show higher degree of racial bias, while this bias seems to be, even if it's present, seems to be a bit like more mitigated in LXXII ratings. If you kind of link these results to the table about the readership I showed you before, one might also like speculate that that might be also depending on the, let's say, socioeconomic characteristics of the readership. Readership of La Gazzetta seems to be a bit more, you know, educated and higher income compared to the ones of Tuttosport and Corriere. So one might question whether like these newspapers are kind of responding to some incentives about, let's say, the demand for discrimination for the readership. But of course, this is just speculation because with our data we cannot really show that in details. Of course, like our results have some implications. And in particular, like more than implication, this kind of results raise some concern. In particular, like about the fact that it might be spillovers effect from newspaper to football supporters. Indeed, like on one side, football fans might develop some kind of adverse preferences towards some players because of their race. And in particular, they might think that like some players, because of their race, are systematically worse, and then this might trigger some kind of violence or racism inside and outside the stadium. on the other side, this kind of bias also might generate some distortion in the markets with monetary prices. I was telling you before about fantasy football, but that might be the same for betting. And so, of course, like these, some of these questions remain unsolved, and of course, like possible implications for the, let's say, for the regulation for the boss of football is also about, not only like controlling the behavior of the fans in the stadium, but also like the source where the fan get the information from. So yeah, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to get all your questions now.
Okay, thank you, Francesco, for a very well-timed talk, very efficient, got through everything very quickly, which is fantastic. We've got loads of time for Q&A. Any questions and comments? If you do have any, please do raise your hand, or you're welcome to put things in the chat as well. So the first hand is, I can't tell, Alessandro.
Okay. Hi, Francesco. Nice to meet you. I have a question. When you want to go back to the descriptive statistic on the journalists that you have, I was thinking you took into account the level of education of the journalists, but I was thinking, for example, like il Corriere della Sera e Gazzetta dello Sport, they are like based in Milan, isn't it? Whereas Tutto Sport is based in Turin. So I was thinking you cannot like find any like differences between the rates they gave to players according to where the place where the pagelle are given. So I was thinking if you cannot like take into account any other differences across like journalists and the newspapers. This was my question.
Thanks for your question. First of all, like I want to tell you that this kind of data are not really about the journalists, but rather about the readership. What we know about the journalists is that they are all like males and white. What you were saying is true somehow. So like Gazzetta is headquartered in Milan, Corriere is in Rome, and Tutto Sport is in Turin. Okay. That's also why, like in our estimate, we always include like teams fixed effect, because we know that these account for like, let's say, difference between teams, because like course like journalists in Turin, it's well known in Italy, for example, that like Tutto Sports tend to be like super in favor of Juventus, and of course we want to account for this kind of, let's say, time varying differences. Okay. Yeah, we did not really check whether, like, let's say, newspaper from the north, from Milan, tend to be, let's say, a bit more adverse towards teams from the south, but that's something we might do indeed. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, because I was thinking sometimes like the pagelle rate for the players differ really a lot, like extremely across like papers, so probably this can have an effect. I was thinking that.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks, Alessandro. Any more questions and comments? Arno.
Sorry, I was struggling with rising hands. I had also a question about trying to understand the mechanism. So during the presentation, you were saying, okay, so journalists may be biased, either by taste or even without realizing it. But then in your conclusion, you kind of reverted to something that I was considering, is that, yeah, journalists want to sell newspapers, so they may want to please their audience. And one way to differentiate that, and I'm not sure that's doable, will be if you observe journalists that move from one newspaper to another one, and do we observe that their rating change when they move to a different newspaper? Is there such occurrence?
Well, no, this is a nice point, but I think in our data, we don't know let's say the exact identity of the journalist, so we don't know who is giving the rating, because then these kind of ratings are published like anonymously by the newspaper. So we will need some kind of let's say inside information to know whether there is some journalist, let's say, moving from one newspaper to another, and then basically observe some variation in his behavior. If that's what you were suggesting, that would be super cool. Yeah, I don't know whether they want to give us this kind of data because our resource they might not like our resource, but this I might try. Yeah.
Sorry, I thought the journalists put their names on their rating, but if they don't, yeah, then it's impossible. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Arno. Alessandro, your hand up again. Is that a new question, or is that just your hand from earlier on? Perhaps it's a hand from earlier on. Any other questions and comments people have? Arno again, go ahead.
I'm happy to have another go if nobody asks. There's always a delay between raising hands and the hands appearing, and so it's funny. Anyway, at the beginning, when you put your regression, you're controlling for performance at the period t-1, rather than I would have thought you would have control for some kind of measures of the performance at period t. Can you explain why you're looking at t-1? That was, or maybe I misread it.
Yeah,
it was not clear to me.
No, that's right. Probably I was not clear enough in my explanation, because basically like the rating we have is the end of the season rating, right? Because we need to match this rating there with the weight which always provided, like let's say at season level. So let's say the t-1, we get the performance which has been like performed in the entire season, and of course determines the end of the season ratings. So that's why it's t-1, to say that the performance came before the rating, that they're not really like simultaneous.
Okay, so sorry, I'm still not sure I get it. the rating that you have is on the game to game.
No, the rating is the end of season.
It's also the end of the season. Sorry, that's where I got it wrong. Okay, yeah, now I follow you.
More questions and comments? Remind me when your sample runs from, Francesco?
Sorry, say it again.
What's your sample time period again? I missed that.
So basically we have data from 2009 to 2018, and we have about like 1,800 observations. Like, so it's like player season observations, yeah. Because of course we need to merge that with the wage data, which is of course only available at season level.
I was going to ask the obvious, really basic question, which is whether you extended it to include the ghost games, because there's been some work recently on the performance of black players without fans. And I think some of it was based in
that was kind of intended like to trim like our data set to the pre-COVID data, because of course we didn't want to get any kind of confining. I mean, like that would be nice for, let's say, an additional analysis to see like whether like I seen some paper like on the performance of the, let's say, black players during a lockdown or during like this ghost game. That would be interesting to see like whether this improvement in performance is also reflected in the an improvement in the ratings, or like if the ratings stays like lower. Well, we decided like to not include this to avoid like any, let's say, COVID-related confounding.
Yeah.
But there is room for an additional analysis as here.
More questions and comments? Well, it looks like it was such a complete presentation that there are hardly any. Oh no, Tunde, go ahead. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, great presentation, really enjoyed it. Thank you. One question I have, probably for my own clarification more than anything else. One of the sets of covariates you have is on the performances of the player. So from the table, I see things like passes and shots on target, those sorts of things. So I just wondered, these are the metrics that we observe players do, but the complexity of football is that there's plenty of stuff that the players do that doesn't get measured, if you would. And I wonder, does that have the potential to affect the results in any way?
Yeah, I mean, yes and not in a sense, because like, of course, like we cannot really exploit, let's say, a fixed effect approach, because our main variable of interest is time invariant. So we cannot really like, clean for let's say, player fixed effect. On the other side, what we do here, of course, is to cluster standard error player levels, and then I think like it's pretty reassuring to see our robustness check or our falsification test check, in which again we use like this kind of artificial intelligence-based algorithm, and which so there is no effect there. Because otherwise, I think like, I mean, it might be a concern only if you believe that, this kind of unobservable characteristics are systematically different between, let's say, black players and white players, which means that, black players are, let's say, better in doing something that it's unobservable rather than white players. That would be like the only way to bias our results, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Tunde. Peter has put in the chat, very interesting research. Seems like we have customer discrimination in newspapers ratings that does not translate to wage discrimination.
Yeah, that's what we can speculate on. Of course, like with our data, I mean, we are pretty careful about this point, because we cannot really argue that, whether this kind of discrimination is intended or unintended, maybe just, related to stereotyping. But yeah, if we take a look at the table of the readership, also, with some kind of background knowledge about the readership of these newspapers, that might be like, let's say, some room for speculation about the fact that some newspaper might be a bit more responsive to the, let's say, the demand for discrimination from the readership. That's also what happens, let's say, in other kind of newspaper, not only sport newspapers. I think every country, some newspaper that, tend to be a bit more, let's say, on the border with some topics, because they know that the readership likes to read when, some person from a minority group commit a crime, rather than like some Italian or local, let's say. But of course, like with our data, we cannot really like, prove the mechanism.
Yeah. Thanks. Any more questions and comments? Okay, well, in which case we can say thank you, Francesco, for a very interesting, comprehensive presentation.
Thanks for having me.
You are welcome, and I see some virtual applause using the facility on Teams. So thank you very much, Francesco. Thanks everyone for comments. Thank you, Jan, as well, for a very interesting paper. We are going to come back again next week when we are going to have Kerry Papps from the University of Bath presenting Running Up That Hill, Fitness in the Face of Recession. So do have a great weekend, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Francesco.